Verkovensky sprawled in his chair at the head of the table with emphatic lack of regard for the assembled company. He had hardly said hello to anyone and now looked around him with an air of haughty disdain. Stavrogin, however, bowed politely to everyone. Although all these people had been waiting for the two of them to appear, every one of them now pretended, as though by common agreement, that they had hardly noticed their arrival. Mrs. Virginsky turned toward Stavrogin and asked him rather gruffly, "Want some tea, Stavrogin?" "Yes, please." "Give Stavrogin some tea," she said to her sister, who was pouring it. "And what about you, Verkovensky?" "Sure I do. Anyway, what's the idea of asking guests whether they want tea? And put some cream in mine this time. Somehow one always gets some unspeakable concoction in this house instead of tea, even at an anniversary or a christening." "Why, you mean to say even you recognize christenings?" The girl student laughed suddenly. "We were just discussing it." "That's old stuff," the schoolboy grunted from the opposite end of the table. "What's old stuff?" "Trying to overcome superstitions is old stuff? I'm afraid it's still very topical, to our great shame." The girl immediately responded to his challenge, leaning forward in her chair. "Anyway, I say there are no harmless superstitions." "All I meant to say," the schoolboy said, becoming terribly agitated, "was that although superstitions do, of course, belong to the past and must be done away with, a silly superstition like christening has been dealt with long ago, and everyone knows that it's stupid, so it's not worth wasting one's time on. And people's wits could be put to better use on more important subjects. You go on and on and on, and it's impossible to make out what you're trying to say," the girl student shouted angrily. "No one is trying to deprive you of your right to speak." Now it was the mistress of the house who sharply interrupted the boy. "You're simply being asked not to chatter like that because no one can understand what you're talking about." "I'm afraid I must object. I am not being treated with due courtesy inasmuch as I'm not being given an opportunity to finish my thought. It's not a lack of ideas, but rather that I have too many of them," the schoolboy muttered, almost despairing and getting completely mixed up. "Well, if you don't know how to express yourself, just shut up," the girl student fired at him. The boy jumped up from his chair. "I simply wished to state," he shouted, burning with shame and not daring to look around him, "that you started all this just to display your wit as soon as Mr. Stavrogin came in, and that's the truth. That's a dirty, unfair thing to say, and it shows that you're still at an inferior stage of mental development. And from now on, I don't wish you to address me," the girl rattled off at full speed. "Stavrogin," the mistress of the house said, "before you came in, they were arguing their heads off about family rights. This man here," she nodded in the direction of the major, "was defending them. Of course, I haven't the slightest intention of bothering you with old rubbish like that, which has long since been settled, but I would still like to know where all these family rights and duties came from. I mean, was it in the form of the superstitions that have come down to us?" "Well, that's my question. What's your opinion on the subject?" "What do you mean? Where did they come from?" "Why, just as we know, for instance, that the superstition about God comes from thunder and lightning," the girl student burst out again, her eyes all but leaping out of her head and flying at Stavrogin. "Today, it's well known that, in their fear of thunder and lightning, primitive men deified the unseen enemy because they felt helpless before him. But where did the superstition about the family originate? Where does the notion of family come from?" "It's not quite the same thing," Mrs. Virginsky said, trying to restrain her sister-in-law. "I'm afraid that an answer to that question would be rather indiscreet," Stavrogin said. "What do you mean?" the girl student said, bending forward in surprise. Titters came from the group of teachers, which were immediately echoed at the other end of the table by Lyamshin, the schoolboy, and, after a brief interval, by the major, who laughed hoarsely. "You should write vaudeville sketches," Mrs. Virginsky said to Stavrogin. "A remark like that doesn't do you any credit, whatever your name is," the student declared, quite indignant now. Next time, don't jump at people like that, her uncle, the major, said to her. Remember, you're a young lady and should know how to behave. You see what happens when you insist on sitting down on a needle. I would appreciate it if you would also keep quiet and abstain from addressing me with such familiarity, and please spare me all your repulsive metaphors. I don't remember meeting you before, and I don't recognize you as a relative of mine. But I happen to be your uncle, and I carried you in my arms when you were a baby. I don't care who or what you may have carried in your arms. I never asked you to carry me around, Mr. Bad-mannered army officer, so I must assume you did it for your own pleasure. And again, I must remind you that I won't tolerate your using that familiar tone with me. That's the way they all are, the major said, banging his fist on the table and apparently addressing Stavrogin, who sat across the table from him. I must say, I'm interested in liberalism and contemporary problems, and I like to listen to intelligent discussions. But I do wish it could be confined to men. I don't care to hear that sort of thing from these modern women. No, sirree, that's something I really can't stand. Stop wriggling, you, he shouted at the girl student, who was bouncing about in her chair. I'm also entitled to have my say. I've been slighted, remember? You only prevent others from talking. You have nothing to say yourself, the lady of the house muttered indignantly. No, I think I'll say what I have on my mind this time, the major said heatedly. I'm counting on you, Mr. Stavrogin, because you've just come in, although I don't have the honor of knowing you. I say that, without men, they'd perish like a bunch of flies. All that stuff about the emancipation of women shows nothing but a lack of originality. I assure you that the whole furor was invented for them by men who, in a moment of aberration, called that trouble down on themselves. I just thank God I'm not married. Women haven't the slightest ability to be original. They can't even invent a new design for their embroidery. Even for that they call on men. Here, for instance, look at her. I carried her in my arms when she was a baby. I danced the mazurka with her when she was 10, and now, when she arrived, I naturally rushed up to give her a big hug. And then the second thing she tells me is that there's no God. Well, I wouldn't mind it so much if it had been the third thing she said, but she had to blurt it out as soon as she'd said hello. All right, I can see that there may be intelligent people who don't believe in God. They arrive at that point by thinking it out and all. But she's just a brat. What do you understand about God? I bet some fellow student taught you that stuff. If he had taught you to light sanctuary lamps before icons, you'd have done that just as zealously. You're a liar and a spiteful man. I have already demonstrated the inconsistency of your views to you. The girl said scornfully, as if it were beneath her dignity to talk to such a person. I told you that in catechism class. We were all taught that if you honor your father and mother, you'll live long and become rich. That comes in the 10 Commandments. Now, if God finds it necessary to offer rewards for love, such a God must be considered immoral. That's how I proved my point to you, and I didn't just blurt it out as soon as I'd said hello. I simply said it because you made a claim on me. Now, whose fault is it if you're so stupid that you still can't understand? That makes you feel bad, and then you get furious, and that explains the behavior of all your generation. Silly goose, the major said. And you're a moron. Go on, insult me. But just a minute, Major, Laputin squeaked from the other end of the table. I'm sure you told me yourself that you didn't believe in God. And suppose I did. It's a different matter for me. I perhaps do believe in God, although not completely. But even if I don't quite believe, I'd still never go around saying that God ought to be shot. When I was still serving in the Hussars, I often used to wonder about God. In all the songs, a hussar drinks and has a great time and all that. But believe me, even then, although I may have actually drunk a lot, I often jumped up from my bed at night and stood in my socks, crossing myself before the icon and beseeching God to give me faith, because even then I couldn't prevent myself from worrying about whether or not God existed. Yes, I had a rough time of it. In the morning, of course, one got distracted and faith vanished, as it were. Yes, in general, I've noticed that in daylight, faith seems to decrease. Do you have a pack of cards by any chance? Verkovensky asked the mistress of the house, yawning quite openly. I'm in full sympathy with your question, the girl student cried, growing crimson with indignation at the major. Precious time is being wasted on stupid talk, Mrs. Virginsky broke in, looking reproachfully at her husband. The girl student drew herself up. I wanted to inform the meeting about the suffering of the students and about their protest. Now, since time has been wasted on idle and immoral discussion, there isn't any such thing as moral or immoral, the schoolboy said, unable to restrain himself once the girl student had opened her mouth. I'm well aware of that, Mr. Schoolboy, and I knew it long before they taught you about it. But I claim, the boy rejoined fiercely, that you're nothing but a brat and that you don't have to tell us things we know already just because you happen to have come from Petersburg. As to the commandment, honor thy father and mother, which you misquoted, everyone in Russia has known it's immoral ever since Belinsky explained that it was. Will this nonsense never end? Mrs. Virginsky said in a determined tone to her husband. Being the mistress of the house, she felt personally ashamed at the silliness of the arguments, particularly since she'd noticed a few smiles and bewildered glances exchanged between the last two arrivals. Ladies and gentlemen, Virginsky said, suddenly raising his voice, if any one of you wishes to speak about something that is more closely connected with the business at hand, or if he has some declaration to make, I suggest he proceed without further delay. I'd like, if I may, to ask one question, said the lame teacher, who till then had sat in dignified silence. I would like to know whether the lot of us gathered here constitute a business meeting or whether we're just a bunch of ordinary mortals come to visit friends. I ask this mostly as a matter of form, but also to dispel any possible misconceptions. This sly question produced its effect. Glances were exchanged, each one expecting the other to answer. Finally, however, everyone somehow wound up staring at Verkovensky and Stavrogin. I suggest we simply take a vote on the question of whether or not we are an official meeting, Mrs. Virginsky said. I second the motion, Laputin said, although it is somewhat vaguely worded. I second it too. Me too. Several voices were heard. Yes, I think it would contribute to a more orderly procedure, Virginsky said in approval. Then let's vote, the mistress of the house declared. You, Lyamshin, please go and sit down at the piano. You'll be able to cast your vote from there when the balloting begins. What, again? Lyamshin protested. Haven't I thumped it often enough for you as it is? I earnestly request you to sit down and play unless you no longer wish to be useful to the cause. But I promise you, Mrs. Virginsky, no one is eavesdropping. It's sheer imagination on your part. And with these high windows, who could understand what's going on here, even if he tried to listen in? We can't understand it ourselves, someone grumbled. But we must always take every possible precaution. I'm thinking of possible spies, she explained, turning to Verkovensky. They'll think we really are having a birthday party when they hear the piano. Ah, damn it, Lyamshin swore. He sat down at the piano and played a waltz, almost banging the keys with his fists. Those who wish this gathering to be an official meeting, raise your right hands, Mrs. Virginsky sang out. Some raised their right hands, others didn't. There were also some who, after raising them at first, at once put them down again. Ah, hell, I don't understand a damn thing, an army officer cried. Neither do I, another said. I do, someone else announced. If it's I, you raise your hand. But what does I mean? It means we're having an official meeting. No, this isn't an official meeting. I voted for an official meeting, the schoolboy shouted, addressing Mrs. Virginsky. So, why didn't you raise your hand? I was watching you, and since you didn't raise yours, I didn't raise mine. Very stupid of you. I didn't raise mine because I proposed the motion. Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest we start all over again. This time, those for the meeting, sit quiet and don't raise your hands. Those against, raise your right hands. Those against, the schoolboy asked. Why, you must be doing it on purpose, Mrs. Virginsky shouted angrily. Now, just a minute, ma'am. Are those who want this to be a meeting or those who don't supposed to raise their right hands? Let's have it clear now. 2 or 3 voices rose in protest. Those who do not want it. That's plain enough. But what are they supposed to do? Raise them or not raise them? One of the officers cried in despair. It doesn't look as if we're quite ripe for a constitution yet, the major remarked. Please, Mr. Lyamshin, take it easy. The way you bang. We can't hear a word of what's going on, the lame teacher pleaded. I assure you, Mrs. Virginsky, no one is trying to eavesdrop, Lyamshin said, jumping up from his stool. Anyway, I don't want to play all the time. I came here as a guest, not a drummer. Ladies and gentlemen, Virginsky suggested. Just speak up now. Are we a meeting or aren't we? We are, came from all sides. All right then, there's no need to vote on it. Enough of that. Are you all satisfied or does someone feel we should still vote? No need, we understand. Perhaps someone among you doesn't wish this to be a meeting. No, we all want a meeting. But what does it mean, a meeting? Someone inquired, but he received no reply. We must elect a chairman, voices came from all directions. The master of the house, of course, Virginsky. Well, if that is your wish, ladies and gentlemen, the elected chairman began, I will repeat my original proposal. If there's anyone here who has something to say more closely connected with the business at hand, let him do so without any further waste of time. A general silence followed, during which all eyes gradually wound up, focused expectantly on Verkovensky and Stavrogin again. Don't you have a statement to make, Verkovensky? The mistress of the house asked, point blank. No, none at all, he answered, stretching in his chair and yawning. Unless... Wait, I think I would like a glass of brandy. And how about you, Stavrogin? No, thank you. Really, I don't drink. I didn't mean about the brandy. I was asking you whether you wanted to speak. About what? No, I don't. They'll bring you some brandy, Mrs. Virginsky told Verkovensky. The girl student stood up. She had made several previous attempts to be recognized. I have come here to report on the sufferings among underprivileged students and on ways to rouse them to protest all over the country. But she stopped short. At the opposite end of the table, another speaker had materialized, and all eyes turned toward him. The long-eared Shigolov, looking gloomy and morose, slowly got to his feet, and with a sad expression, placed a voluminous, closely written notebook on the table. He stood there in complete silence. Many looked with surprise at the notebook. Laputin, Virginsky, and the lame teacher, however, seemed very pleased about something. I'd like to address the meeting, Shigolov said mournfully but firmly. You have the floor, Virginsky said, authorizing him to speak. The speaker sat down, remained silent another half-minute, then said in a grave voice, Ladies and gentlemen, here's that brandy, Mrs. Virginsky's sister, who had been pouring the tea, announced in a scornful and disgusted tone. She brought a bottle and a glass that she carried between her fingers without tray or saucer and put them in front of Verkovensky. The interrupted orator looked around with offended dignity. Never mind, go on. I wasn't listening anyway, Verkovensky shouted, pouring brandy into his glass. Ladies and gentlemen, Shigolov started again. I request your attention and, as you will see later, I ask for your assistance in a matter of prime importance. But first of all, I must say a few words to introduce my main point. Say, Mrs. Virginsky, do you have a pair of scissors by any chance? Peter Verkovensky asked suddenly. What do you want scissors for? She asked, looking him pop-eyed. I forgot to cut my nails. I've been meaning to do it for 3 days, Verkovensky said, examining his long, rather dirty nails with detachment. Mrs. Virginsky flushed with anger, but Miss Virginsky, the student, seemed to enjoy Peter's interruption. I believe I saw them over there on the windowsill, she announced. She got up, found the scissors, and brought them to Peter, who took them without even looking at her and started working on his nails. Mrs. Virginsky thought there must be a reason for Peter's action, and suddenly became ashamed of her first reaction. The members of the meeting exchanged glances in silence. The lame teacher watched Verkovensky spitefully and enviously. Shigalov went on with his speech. Having devoted all my energies to a study of the social organization that will supersede the present one in the future society, I have come to the conclusion that all those who have devised social systems, from antiquity down to this very year, have been nothing but dreamers, writers of fairy tales, and fools who have contradicted themselves because they have understood nothing about the natural sciences or about the strange animal called man. Plato, Rousseau, Fourier, aluminum pillars, all that may be fit for sparrows, but certainly not for human society. But we need to know what the future organization of society will be, especially now that we are about to go over to action. So we won't have to think any more about it. I therefore wish to propose my own system of world organization. It is all in here, he announced, slapping the notebook in front of him. I had hoped it would be possible to present my book to this meeting in abbreviated form, but I realize now that I will have to add many more oral explanations, so I estimate that a comprehensive presentation will take at least 10 evening sessions, one for each chapter of my work. Some laughter from the audience. Furthermore, I must warn you that my system is not yet complete. More laughter. I have become entangled in my own data, and my conclusions directly contradict my original premises. I started out with the idea of unrestricted freedom, and I have arrived at unrestricted despotism. I must add, however, that any solution of the social problem other than mine is impossible. The laughter grew louder and louder, but it was the young, the obviously less indoctrinated ones who laughed the most. Mrs. Virginsky, Laputin, and the lame teacher looked rather annoyed. But if you yourself have failed to develop an acceptable system and even despair of arriving at one, what then are we supposed to do? One of the officers inquired cautiously. Well, you have a good point there, Mr. Officer, Shigalov answered cuttingly. And you're right to use the word despair. Yes, I was in despair, but that doesn't alter the fact that what is written in this book cannot be changed and that no one will ever find a way out. So I invite all those gathered here to devote 10 evenings to the study of my book and afterward to express their opinions on the subject. Now, if the meeting refuses to listen to me, we'd better speak up here and now. Let the men go back to serving the state and the women return to their kitchens, because if they don't accept my book, they'll never find any other solution. There is none. If they miss the opportunity I am offering them, they will only hurt themselves because they are bound to have to face the facts later. So everything boils down to Shigalov's despair, Limeshin concluded. And thus the outstanding question is whether Shigalov should or should not despair. Shigalov's despair is a private matter, the schoolboy declared. I propose we take a vote on whether Shigalov's despair has a bearing upon the state of our common cause and whether we should spend so many evenings listening to him or not, an officer said cheerfully. Well, I don't think that's quite the point, the lame teacher finally managed to put in, speaking with a sort of sarcastic grin that made it very difficult to tell whether or not he was serious. I would like to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that perhaps Mr. Shigalov is taking his problem a little too much to heart and is, besides, too modest. I know his book. He offers as a final social solution the division of mankind into two uneven categories. 1/10 will be granted individual freedom and full rights over the remaining 9/10, who will lose their individuality and become something like a herd of cattle. Gradually, through unlimited obedience and a series of mutations, they will attain a state of primeval innocence, something akin to the original paradise on Earth, although, of course, they'll have to work. The procedure Mr. Shigalov suggests, which would deprive 9/10 of mankind of their free will and transform them into a herd through re-education of entire generations, is very interesting. It is based on data gathered from the natural sciences and is very logical. We may disagree with some of his conclusions, but we must give the author's intelligence and vast knowledge their due. It's really a shame that his stipulation that we should devote 10 evenings to his theories is impractical, for otherwise I'm sure we would have heard many very interesting ideas. You're not serious, are you? Mrs. Virginsky asked the lame teacher with a certain alarm. So this man, not knowing what to do with people, turns 9/10 of them into slaves? I have suggested for a long time that he might come up with something like that. You are talking about your brother, remember, the lame teacher reminded her. Who cares about family relationships? You're not trying to pull my leg by any chance, are you? And those people have to work for the nobles and obey them as if they were gods. That's real degradation, the girl student said. What I'm offering is not degradation, but paradise on earth, Shigalov said peremptorily. Anyway, there's no other solution, he concluded. But instead of your paradise on earth, Lyamshin shouted, I'd grab those 9/10 of mankind and blow them sky high, leaving only the well-educated 10th, who would then live happily ever after, in accordance with scientific method. Only a clown would say such a thing, the girl student cried, flushing. He's a clown, all right, but he's a useful clown, Mrs. Virginsky whispered in her ear. Perhaps yours would indeed be the best solution to the problem, Shigalov said, turning excitedly toward Lyamshin. You don't even know how important what you've just said is, Mr. Funnyman. But since your proposal is impractical, we must content ourselves with what you call paradise on earth. What bunk, Verkovensky couldn't help muttering, although he went on cutting his nails and showed no signs of concern. Why is it bunk? The lame teacher said, pouncing on him as if a word from Peter was all he had been waiting for. Why bunk? In a way, Mr. Shigalov is a fanatic of humanitarianism, but then think of Fourier, Cabet, and even Proudhon himself. They provide plenty of incredible and tyrannical solutions to the problem. Mr. Shigalov's approach may even be more realistic than theirs. I assure you, when one reads his book, it is impossible not to agree with certain things he says. Perhaps less than any other can he be accused of being unrealistic. His paradise on earth is almost the true thing, an idol, the loss of which, if it ever existed, mankind keeps bemoaning. Damn it! I could have bet I'd get involved in an argument, Verkovensky muttered again. And let me tell you, sir, the lame teacher continued, becoming more and more agitated, that to think about and discuss the future social structure is almost a compulsion among our contemporaries. It was Herzen's sole concern all his life. As to Belinsky, I know for certain that he spent entire evenings debating the future social organization with his friends, and deciding in advance the smallest of its, so to speak, domestic arrangements. Some even go nuts, the Major suddenly remarked. Still, I say there's a greater possibility of arriving at something by talking it over than by just sitting and taking on dictatorial airs, Laputin hissed, apparently at last plucking up enough courage to start his attack. When I said bunk, I wasn't talking about Shigalov, Verkovensky mumbled. What I meant, he added, raising his eyes slightly from his nails, was that in my opinion all those books, all those Fouriers, Cabets, and this stuff of Shigalov's too, and the business about human rights, it's all a kind of fiction. And you can write hundreds of thousands of such fictions if you feel like it. It's nothing but an aesthetic pastime. I can well understand that you people get bored in this lousy little town, so you go for any scrap of paper, as long as there's something written on it. Just a minute, sir, just a minute. The lame teacher stopped him, fidgeting in his chair. I concede that we're only small-town folk, and for that alone deserve to be pitied. Still, we feel pretty sure that nothing has yet happened in the world that we could have missed completely. Now, for instance, we've been told, through the intermediary of foreign-made leaflets, to close our ranks and form cells for the sole purpose of total destruction because, it's contended, there's no longer any cure for the world, and the only way is the radical measure of chopping off 100 million heads. Then, after thus easing our burden, we will be able to leap over the ditch with much less trouble. There's no doubt that it's a very bright idea, but I submit it's just as unrealistic as Mr. Shigalov's theories, to which you referred with such contempt just now. Well, I didn't come here to debate, Verkovensky said, muttering some strong expression under his breath, apparently unaware that he had